A thin crust of late winter snow clung to the cobblestones outside the railway station, where a relocation checkpoint had been assembled from rope barricades, fuel drums, and canvas inspection tables, converting the plaza into a system for sorting civilians according to transport eligibility during wartime Europe. A coal stove burned beside the main awning to keep the clerks' hands warm while they signed ledgers and checked ration booklets, and the scent of soot lingered in the air, alongside the faint, metallic tang of kerosene from the convoy trucks idling near the freight shed. Civilians queued in narrow columns with ration papers and carbon slips folded between gloved fingers, shuffling forward in small increments as guards examined identity cards beneath the muted light of a single electric bulb. The checkpoint was not designed for comfort nor forgiveness. It existed to determine who would be permitted to board the convoy heading to the safer interior districts, and who would remain in the city as supplies dwindled and rumors of new restrictions circulated. Among the waiting civilians stood a widowed woman in her 30s, suitcase resting by her boots, ration booklet open to the pages the clerks always requested, district classification, marital status, and relocation eligibility. She had memorized the sequence required to pass through the checkpoint efficiently. Step forward, place suitcase down, present booklet, wait for stamp, retrieve carbon slip. Around her, the other evacuees rehearsed similar rituals in silence, because conversation and ration lines often disrupted the fragile order that kept transport moving. A nurse in a wool coat moved along the queue, checking for the elderly, the sick, and the very young, as these categories were prioritized by district rules that had been amended twice since autumn. The widow watched as families inched toward the inspection table, handing over documents with a posture that revealed both necessity and fear. Necessity because relocation offered shelter and rationed heat, and fear because a misplaced stamp could mean denial without appeal. The convoy trucks rumbled in intervals, warming their engines for departure, and the sight of the tarpaulin-covered benches inside their beds reminded civilians that survival now traveled in canvas and petrol rather than in villages and hearths. When the guard at the inspection table finally lifted his chin toward her, she stepped forward with careful deliberation, not to seek sympathy, but to enter the machinery of wartime classification that decided who moved and who waited. The guard extended his hand for the ration booklet, flipping through the pages with the detached efficiency of someone who had inspected hundreds of similar documents since dawn. And although his expression revealed nothing, his pause at the surname printed beneath the widow's identification entry lasted just long enough to alter the flow of the queue behind her. He closed the booklet, tapped the cover once with his thumb, and without offering explanation, pointed toward a roped-off corner beside a stack of wooden supply crates. Clarifications, he said, using the term civilians had learned to associate with delays that rarely favored the person subjected to them. The widow obeyed the instruction immediately, because protests in checkpoint zones rarely accelerated decisions and often invited suspicion rather than dialogue. She lifted her suitcase, walked to the crates, and stepped behind the rope barrier as the guard resumed processing the next civilian, with no further acknowledgement of her presence. From behind the cordon, she watched families advance through the inspection table toward the registration hut, where clerks logged district codes into the convoy manifest and distributed the carbon slips required for boarding. A nurse tied cloth tags to children's coats indicating their medical status, while a clerk weighed elderly evacuees and scribbled figures into a ledger because seats closest to the front of the convoy were reserved for passengers with limited mobility. The widow's suitcase rested against the brick wall, dusted with snow that melted in slow beads across the leather strap. She tightened her scarf, not from vanity, but because the wind had begun to move across the courtyard in long, uninterrupted gusts that carried coal smoke from the convoy trucks into the open air. Behind the rope, time distorted in familiar wartime increments, measured not in hours or minutes, but in the number of civilians who passed through administrative gates while she remained stationary. Each family admitted into the registration hut represented the quiet arithmetic of scarcity. Fewer seats, fewer billets, fewer blankets available in the district housing facilities that awaited evacuees. A clerk emerged from the hut with her booklet in hand, but did not look toward the widow. Instead, he conferred with the guards at the inspection table, pointing at an entry in the housing section of the ration booklet. The guards nodded without calling her forward or returning the booklet to her. The widow raised her voice just enough to ask whether her district stamp was invalid, but the guard closest to her shook his head and repeated, "Clarifications," as though the word itself were authority enough. Civilians glanced in her direction but quickly looked away, unwilling to risk being associated with someone under administrative scrutiny, because scrutiny could spread more efficiently than documents. Snow collected on the rope fibers, and the convoy engines idled with a steady vibration that reminded civilians that boarding windows would eventually close whether her status was resolved or not. The widow remained behind the cordon, neither processed nor dismissed. Unsuspended between paperwork and rumor in a space where few offered compassion and none offered explanations. Rumors did not need volume to travel. They required only direction, and the checkpoint provided it as naturally as the wind found seams in walls. When the clerk returned to the inspection table with the widow's ration booklet and whispered something into the guard's ear while pointing first at the surname and then at the housing classification field, the posture alone was enough for the cue to construct an interpretation. A mother, waiting with two young children, leaned toward the family beside her and murmured that the widow was being held for examination, a phrase civilians used when the issue might be bureaucratic. But when a teenage boy carrying a tin of coal fragments overheard the mother and added, with casual certainty, that the widow was married to one of them, the tone shifted from administrative inconvenience to social verdict. Civilians glanced toward the cordoned corner, with expressions that carried a kind of calculated distance. Sympathy withheld until guilt or innocence could be established through the informal court of rumor. In wartime, a surname did not merely identify lineage. It suggested allegiance, whether or not allegiance had ever been chosen or reciprocated. The widow kept her hands wrapped around the handle of her suitcase, not to anchor herself but because it was the only gesture that did not attract attention. The coal smoke mingled with the cold air, thinning into a haze that settled over the yard, and through that haze whispers continued to accumulate into a narrative the way frost accumulated on the crates beside her. A man farther down the line announced, without evidence, that she must be waiting for the Americans to take her under protection, as though such protection were a currency civilians could request without paperwork. Another civilian countered that the Americans would not take a collaborator, and the word collaborator, once spoken, gained more traction than any stamp or ledger could refute. No one asked the widow to clarify her status, and even if they had, she would not have offered the history behind her surname, that her late husband had served under the occupying forces only because conscription promised extra bread rations at a time when flour was rarer than coal. Motivation did not travel through rumor. Only labels did. A clerk retrieved her booklet once more and compared the housing classification to the transport eligibility code, shaking his head not as condemnation, but as frustration at mismatched fields that complicated manifests. Yet to the civilians watching, the gesture resembled confirmation of wrongdoing. A nurse assisting the elderly took notice of the whispered accusations, but did not intervene. Nurses controlled blankets and medical forms, not public opinion. The queue edged forward while the widow's position remained unchanged, and with each admission into the registration hut, space tightened in the convoy manifest. A group of evacuees near the freight shed repositioned themselves to avoid standing too close to the cordon, not out of malice, but because in wartime proximity to uncertainty invited risk, even if that risk was merely social. The rope that separated the widow from the queue had begun as an administrative boundary, but was now treated as a social quarantine zone, policed not by guards, but by rumor. No official had declared her ineligible, yet no civilian acknowledged her as part of the community of evacuees any longer. She remained physically present, but categorically excluded, assigned a role she had not applied for, and could not contest while the rumble of convoy engines announced that time moved forward for everyone, except those waiting for clarifications. At the far edge of the checkpoint, near the chalkboard that listed convoy departure sectors and seat allotments, an American transport lieutenant stood reviewing the manifest sheets clipped to a worn clipboard, cross-checking numbers against the head counts recorded earlier that morning by clerks, with cold, stiffened fingers. His assignment did not involve adjudicating civilian disputes or correcting social rumor. His responsibility was to ensure that the convoy departed on schedule, properly seated, and without exceeding the rationed fuel allocated for the journey inland. Yet American officers supervising logistical corridors in Europe had developed a particular habit. They scanned crowds not for sentiment but for bottlenecks, because bottlenecks delayed schedules, and schedules controlled survival more effectively than speeches. It was through this lens that he noticed the widow behind the rope cordon. She did not call attention to herself, did not plead for assistance, and did not attempt to breach the barrier. She simply waited, suitcase upright, ration booklet pressed against her palm, eyes fixed on the registration hut as though watching admission into another country. The lieutenant traced the queue backward with his gaze, observing how civilians shifted away from the cordon with a choreography that suggested not contagion, but consensus. He saw two clerks confer over a booklet, the same booklet he later recognized as hers, before one carried it toward the inspection table, and the other returned to the hut. He saw the guard at the table close the booklet and tuck it beneath a stack without returning it to its owner. Then he noted the absence of any procedural announcement that would justify the delay. None of this guaranteed injustice. Wartime paperwork often contained contradictions that required signatures from offices not yet open for the day. Still, his attention held. When a teenage boy mimed the phrase, "enemy's woman," at another evacuee, the lieutenant caught the gesture and its context, and although he could not hear the words, the choreography of rumor rarely required translation. The lieutenant shifted his stance to gain a clearer view of the ration booklet when the clerk placed it briefly on the corner of a supply crate while retrieving a pen. His eyes landed on the district stamp printed beneath the identification entry, blue ink, relocation code, all correct insignia, indicating widow civilian extraction eligibility under the regional evacuation charter. The stamp did not promise comfort or sympathy. It promised movement, and movement was what evacuation corridors existed to provide. If a housing classification conflicted with transport eligibility, the contradiction required administrative correction, not cordon isolation. Rumor had no authority to overrule district codes. The lieutenant closed the manifest clipboard with a muted snap, tucked it beneath his arm, and stepped away from the chalkboard. His walk toward the cordon did not produce spectacle. Uniforms often attracted attention simply by entering a space where uncertainty collected. Clerks glanced briefly toward him, not to seek approval, but to determine whether procedures were about to be recalibrated. The lieutenant positioned himself beside the rope, angled his body so the wind would not blow snow directly into the widow's face, and asked the guard in a low tone, "Classification?" The guard hesitated, glanced toward the booklet, and offered a non-committal shrug meant to signify pending. The lieutenant tapped the booklet twice with a gloved finger, once on the identification entry and once on the relocation stamp, and waited for the guard to recognize that paperwork had already issued its verdict. Rumor had merely issued commentary. The lieutenant lifted the ration booklet from the supply crate with the same precision he used when handling convoy manifests, because in wartime, the difference between rumor and eligibility was often printed in small text beside a district stamp. He opened the booklet to the identification entry, verified the widow's age and residence, then traced his gloved finger to the relocation district code printed beneath the official seal. The code matched the convoy listed on the chalkboard behind him. Sector F. Extraction priority for widowed civilians and families displaced by requisition zones. None of these fields were ambiguous, and none of them justified isolation behind a rope. Without raising his voice, he said to the guard, "District verified," a phrase that in administrative settings held more authority than any lecture on fairness. The guard shifted his weight, eyes darting from the lieutenant to the queue and back again, caught between the informal court of rumor and the formal hierarchy of procedure. The lieutenant flipped to the housing classification field, the section that had triggered the clerk's hesitation. Housing categories determined where evacuees would sleep once transported, not whether they would be transported at all. "Housing is municipal," the lieutenant said, tone flat. "Transport is regional." The distinction was not philosophical, it was logistical. A municipal misclassification could be corrected at the destination, but transport denial could strand civilians in contested districts with no further convoys scheduled for weeks. The guard exhaled, not in disagreement, but in recognition that rumor had carried more weight than ledger codes for longer than it should have. The lieutenant closed the booklet and pointed at the rope. "Release her to processing," he instructed, and although there was no ceremony in his words, the instruction arrived like a wedge driven between rumor and authority. The guard lifted the rope, allowing the widow to step back into the corridor of evacuees. Conversations paused, not out of fear, but because rumor had been overruled without spectacle. The widow took her ration booklet in both hands and waited for direction, suitcase at her boots, posture composed not as defiance, but as compliance with the machinery of evacuation. The lieutenant guided her to the inspection table, placed the booklet before the clerk, and tapped the relocation district stamp with a single finger. "Transport eligible," he said, and the clerk, who moments earlier had hesitated at the surname, now retrieved his pencil and ledger without contest. He transcribed the widow's information into the manifest column for evacuees, marking seat allocation as pending review until carbon slips could be printed. Behind them, the rumor that had animated the yard moments earlier began to collapse under the weight of paperwork. Accusations made sense only when unchallenged, and once confronted with district codes. Rumor had no bureaucracy to lean on. The clerk tore a form from a pad, attached it to the widow's booklet with a paper clip, and stamped the identification page with the blue ink reserved for convoy clearance. The sound of the stamp was sharp, final, and familiar to civilians who had waited hours for such confirmation. It signified neither mercy nor favoritism, only procedure, restored to its correct function. The lieutenant returned the booklet to the widow and said, "Proceed to registration," the closest wartime language offered to reassurance. She nodded once, lifted her suitcase with both hands, and moved toward the registration hut with the quiet steadiness of someone who understood that dignity was not a sentiment, but a classification that could be documented, verified, and stamped onto paper. The rope behind her fell slack, no longer guarded, because authority had migrated from rumor to ledger where it belonged. The path from the inspection table to the registration hut formed a narrow corridor, framed by wooden stakes and rope that once delineated market stalls before rationing, transformed civilian commerce into administrative queues. The widow entered the corridor with her suitcase held against her leg, ration booklet clasped beneath her thumb, and the blue convoy stamp still moist on the identification page. The lieutenant followed at a measured distance, clipboard in hand, not as escort in the sentimental sense, but as logistical oversight. American officers had learned that paperwork gained authority from proximity. Inside the registration hut, a kerosene lamp burned atop a metal filing cabinet, and a clerk seated at a collapsible desk instructed evacuees to present their booklets one at a time. The widow stepped forward when called, now sliding her booklet across the table with the understated precision of someone who understood the value of orderly transactions in wartime. The clerk examined the district stamp, matched the relocation code to the convoy listed on the chalkboard outside, and located her name on the temporary ledger that tracked civilians awaiting manifest entry. He paused briefly at the surname, not as judgment, but as verification, and then wrote her district information into the convoy manifest, marking the field beside her name with a notation, "Seat allocation pending, Sector F." He handed her a carbon slip printed in triplicate, instructing her to keep one copy on her person for boarding, another for housing intake upon arrival, and a third for ration allotments at the destination. From there, a nurse wearing a wool coat and carrying a satchel of cloth bands guided evacuees to the tagging station. The widow lifted her suitcase onto the wooden crate beside the nurse, who wrapped a small cloth band around the handle bearing the district code and convoy number, then pinned a matching card to the widow's coat just below the collarbone. These tags had replaced paper tickets weeks earlier because cloth survived snow, wind, and jostling during unloading with far fewer losses. Once tagged, the widow joined a small group of evacuees near the brazier under the overhang where benches had been arranged to keep civilians from clustering around the convoy trucks prematurely. The brazier emitted enough heat to thaw the edges of gloves and coax breath into warmer clouds, and although the benches were not comfortable, they represented a category of safety that civilians recognized instinctively. Those who sat awaited boarding, not review. The lieutenant stood a few paces away, cross-checking the manifest columns against the convoy seating plan and ensuring medical evacuees would be placed near personnel capable of assistance during transport. Civilians whispered among themselves, comparing carbon slips, district codes, and seat assignments without invoking rumors from the cordon. Bureaucracy had replaced gossip as the dominant language, and gossip, lacking tables or ledgers, could not compete in this environment. After a short interval, a corporal exited the registration hut and called out seat numbers in sequence. When the widow heard her number, Sector F, Row 3, Seat 11, she rose without hesitation, suitcase in hand, main carbon slip extended for verification. The corporal stamped the slip, noted her boarding in the manifest, and directed her toward the convoy truck designated for Sector F evacuees. The tarpaulin at the rear had been lifted, revealing wooden benches arranged in 2 rows with wool blankets folded along the interior rail. The widow climbed onto the step, placed her suitcase beneath the bench, and settled into the narrow space allotted for the journey inward. Outside, the lieutenant exchanged a brief nod with the convoy sergeant, confirming that the widow's seat had been logged. No sentiment passed between them, only accuracy, and in wartime accuracy carried more dignity than sympathy ever could. The convoy truck lurched forward a few feet as the engine settled into its idling rhythm, and civilians adjusted their seating, tucking coats beneath their thighs and wrapping blankets around their shoulders to blunt the cold that seeped through the canvas walls. The widow sat with her suitcase beneath the bench, carbon slip folded into her glove, and ration booklet resting against her lap. Her presence attracted no commentary here. Seats on convoy benches did not belong to rumor, but to manifests, and manifests answered only to officers and clerks. A medical orderly seated across from her observed the slight tremor in her hands and passed her a tin cup of water from his canteen, not as gesture of sympathy, but as routine field practice. Dehydrated passengers fared poorly on long transport routes. She accepted the cup with a nod, and the orderly resumed checking the blankets for cuts or loose stitching. A corporal climbed into the truck holding the manifest ledger and began verifying seat assignments, row by row. When he reached the widow, he paused for the briefest moment as his eyes flicked from her surname to the convoy stamp on her ration booklet, then to the cloth band fastened to her coat. The pause did not lengthen into hesitation. He stamped her carbon slip with the same ink used for every other passenger and marked her seat as confirmed in the ledger. That single action, unembellished, administrative, final, restored more dignity than any public apology could have offered at the checkpoint hours earlier. The ledger traveled down the row, absorbing names, codes, and seats without commentary. And, when the corporal finished his inspection, he banged twice on the truck wall to signal readiness. Outside, civilians who had once whispered, "Enemy's woman," watched the convoy preparations with a new silence, not driven by remorse, but by recognition that rumor had failed to translate into policy. The lieutenant stood near the tailgate reviewing final clearance forms, confirming that the convoy was ready for departure. When he approached the truck, the widow straightened slightly, not in deference, but in acknowledgement of the role he had played in realigning her status to the categories printed in her booklet, rather than those invented by the queue. The lieutenant tapped her carbon slip once, with the back of his pencil, and said, "Logged," a word with no embellishment, and no praise but with the full weight of inclusion. He then signed the last clearance form for Sector F, handed it to the convoy sergeant, and stepped back from the tailgate. The convoy sergeant shouted the departure order, and the engine revved higher before the truck rolled out of the courtyard, past the rope that had once served as a boundary of exclusion. The checkpoint remained behind them, processing new civilians and new rumors, but the widow no longer occupied a space where rumor held jurisdiction. She occupied a seat documented in ink, stamped in duplicate, and recognized by the machinery that governed movement during wartime. In a conflict that prized efficiency over sentiment, recognition through paperwork had become the closest available form of respect. The convoy traveled along a narrow road marked by blackout signs and stripped trees, whose branches rattled against the tarpaulin whenever the wind shifted. Passengers leaned forward during sharp turns and settled again when the truck straightened, their movements synchronized by necessity rather than companionship. The widow watched the landscape transition from the dense stone of the city to the sparse timber of the countryside, where snow had gathered in long, unbroken drifts along the ditches. She counted the ration bands on her coat once to confirm their alignment, and then tucked the carbon slip deeper into her glove to protect it from moisture. Every evacuee knew that slips lost in transit complicated intake processing and could delay housing assignments for days. After an hour, the convoy halted at an interior district intake station, converted from a schoolhouse with blackout curtains, coal stoves, and bunk frames arranged in rows, where chalkboards had once displayed arithmetic problems. Passengers disembarked in small groups, tagging their luggage crates with corresponding district codes. The widow retrieved her suitcase and followed the line toward the intake desk, where clerks operating beneath a kerosene lamp collected carbon slips, cross-referenced manifest entries, and stamped arrival confirmation fields in ration booklets. When her turn came, the clerk examined her surname without reaction, checked the relocation code against the convoy records, and pressed the arrival stamp firmly onto the passenger copy. He then tore a housing billet from a pad and handed it to her with instructions. Dormitory Hall C. Bread and broth in the annex. No commentary, no hesitation, no rumor. She proceeded through the hallway where cots had been arranged beneath maps of Europe, pinned to the walls with thumbtacks now serving as makeshift anchors for military charts. She placed her suitcase beside a bunk near the stove, removed her gloves, and folded her coat at the foot of the mattress. Around her, evacuees settled into their new spaces, with the muted efficiency of people accustomed to temporary arrangements, unpacking only what was necessary for survival: blankets, utensils, and documents. The lieutenant entered the schoolhouse a short time later, clipboard beneath his arm, verifying that the convoy manifest aligned with intake headcounts. When he passed her bunk, he paused just long enough to hand her ration booklet back. She had not noticed that it had been retained during intake, and nodded once, a gesture that carried neither sentiment nor narrative flourish. "Records complete," he said, before returning to the entrance to confer with the intake sergeant. The phrase contained no comfort, yet it restored something larger than comfort. It finalized her status according to the classifications that governed movement in wartime. The widow sat on the edge of the bunk, ration booklet resting atop her suitcase, while the coal stove crackled and the intake clerk called new names from a ledger. Beyond the blackout curtains, the war continued without regard for the corridors she had traveled or the rumors she had shed. But yet, she no longer carried the label assigned at the checkpoint. Not because crowds had apologized, but because paperwork had replaced accusation, and in the logic of evacuation, paperwork was the closest available mechanism for dignity.